Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to pursue a question that I originally asked in this place on November 8th of last year. I prefaced my question by talking about a quite remarkable program in my riding. Local public high school, Claremont High School, raises money every year, and it's called Rails to Relevance. Kids from Saanich Gulf Islands, Claremont High School, get on a train in Vancouver. They make their way to Ottawa. They also tour Montreal, Quebec City. But the extraordinary learning experience of being on the train is irreplaceable. I actually ride with them as often as I can and give them a discussion about Westminster parliamentary democracy and the nature of Canada's democracy on board the train. It's a quite extraordinary experience, and one far too few Canadians have, of traveling this country by rail. The Minister of Transportation gave a very good answer that day. He said he was very committed to passenger rail service. So one might ask why I'm up at adjournment proceedings and still concerned. I'm concerned because I'm not sure the management of Via Rail understands the importance of passenger rail service across Canada. And I know that the data collection about the people who use Via Rail is often misleading. I can give an example of this. There's generally been a trend towards treating the transcontinental portions of Via. Now, I know the Quebec-Windsor corridor, particularly since this government came to office, has had more money, and the schedules have been improved in that Windsor to Quebec corridor. But there is service for Canadians from Montreal to Halifax in what's called the Ocean line, and from Toronto to Vancouver in the Canadian. And the impression one would get from the way that service is run is that it is essentially a high-end land-based cruise and that it's for tourists. The data collected by Via Rail, when I last spoke to them about it, would have suggested that was the case. And it isn't unless you visit the economy sections of the train where you find local transit. You see families because while it's cheaper to fly from Toronto to Vancouver than take the train, if you have small children and you're traveling from Edmonton to Winnipeg, it's definitely not cheaper to fly. Via Rail has discounts for seniors, discounts for children. And if you want a cheaper way to travel, you're better off in the economy section of the train and bringing your own food. This is unfortunate. In the old days, Via Rail would allow someone from economy to go forward and buy in the dining car. We've created a high-end luxury travel experience, and if that's how it's perceived, then its service for passenger rail will be at risk. The report prepared by, it was commissioned under the previous government and prepared under former Minister Emerson's guidance, basically said that all support for passenger rail from Toronto West and Montreal East should be eliminated. And what I'm pleading for is management at Via Rail, with the leadership of this government, to recognize that we need a legislative framework for Via Rail, just as the U.S. has for Amtrak. I have a private member's bill to that effect. And that we need to fund Via Rail and conceive of it as part of a national transportation system in the context of a post-carbon economy. We need to do much more to modernize rail. Where I live in Saanich Gulf Islands, we used to have a Victoria to Courtenay daily railroad, the Corridor Island Rail Service. It needs funding. Where I used to live in Cape Breton Island, we used to have service from Halifax to Sydney. We used to have daily service a couple of times a day from Halifax to Yarmouth or Halifax to Wolfville. There are many rail lines across this country that are still in place and could provide low-cost, low-carbon, efficient, modern passenger service.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Member from Saanich Gulf Island for her question and for her advocacy. Let me start by reassuring her that the government is and has always been committed to passenger rail services, as we recognize the value and historic importance of such services to the Canadian public. Canada's iconic coast-to-coast rail system highlights the connectivity and the unity of our country, while our intercity passenger rail also addresses many key mobility needs of Canadians. It does this by providing accessible transportation options for persons with disabilities and connecting communities with little or no alternative year-round public transportation. Moreover, the passenger rail is often acknowledged as a fuel-efficient means of transportation, thereby helping us lessen our carbon footprint on the environment. On this, we definitely agree. The minister's mandate is to ensure that the Canadian transportation system supports our economic growth while providing a service that is safe, reliable, environmentally responsible, and enhances the passenger's experience. That is why we have launched the Transportation 2030 strategy, setting the path forward for Canada's transportation system. Within this strategy, we are committed to investing in innovative and green transportation that will allow Canadians to move freely and efficiently. Currently, our government is considering options to enhance and modernize national passenger rail services to better meet the transportation needs of Canadians. In Budget 2016, we allocated $45 million to various Via Rail projects, including $7.7 million to support technical studies on the renewal of its fleet and for safety upgrades, as well as $3.3 million over 3 years to support an in-depth assessment of Via Rail's high-frequency rail proposal. After considering the results of this assessment, we have decided to undertake the additional foundational work required to advance any project of this scale, with $8 million of funding announced in Budget 2018. Furthermore, we were pleased to announce this Monday funding for Via Rail's fleet renewal. Via will launch its procurement process in spring of 2018 to replace Via's coaches and locomotives in the Windsor-Quebec City corridor. New trains will improve reliability, enhance accessibility for passengers with disabilities, and reduce smog and cancer-causing emissions. We are proud of the investing in passenger rail to make travel more accessible and efficient for all Canadians. It will support economic growth and job creation and promote a sustainable environment for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for such a positive response. Let me just mention one of the other big concerns, and it's structural. This will take real leadership. Since the creation of Via Rail in the 1970s, the tracks that were created for both passenger and freight were consigned to freight, and then over time, by 1994, CN became a privatized corporation, and the tracks, whether CN, CP, or other private companies, are leased back to Via Rail. This impedes Via's ability to provide on-time performance because the trains are always sidelined for freight. I'm very concerned about these twin threats. We've got grain piling up in the prairies that can't get to Vancouver, and we've got passengers sitting on the sideline hoping a freight train might pass. Ultimately, we need to have a national rail service that serves passengers and freight, and I know it's a tall order, but I'm hoping the Parliamentary Secretary can do it.
Parliamentary Secretary.
I'd like to thank my honourable colleague and reassure that the government does recognize the importance of intercity passenger rail services, and we will continue to support it. The Minister of Transport is responsible for making sure that the mobility needs of Canadians are met. Access to a safe, reliable, and efficient transportation network promotes economic growth and strengthens our middle class. Likewise, a mobile Canada means a more prosperous nation, and that's why in our strategic plan, Transportation 2030, we have given the traveller such a high priority. Notably, our strategy is aimed at providing more options and better service for travellers while securing the long-term financial viability of passenger rail. We're heading in the right direction, Mr. Speaker, but there is more work to be done. Thank you.